Hi, I painted this panda back in COVID times, but I've recreated it now as a video to share with you on YouTube. If you enjoy this demonstration, please give it a like or leave a comment, and better still, please subscribe so that you can keep informed whenever I add some new content. In the description below the video, you'll also find the materials that I have used for this demonstration. Our next painting project is going to be creating interesting darks for a black and white subject. Just because they're black and white doesn't mean to say that we leave the white of the paper for the white and dip into some black paint for the black area. That would be very, very boring. So we still want to try and mix up interesting dark colours that will read as black even if they're not truly black, but they will be interesting and colourful darks, and that's what we're after here. So I'm going to do a little bit of colour mixing to show you how we're going to get the dark paint. I've just drawn mine up on a quarter sheet of watercolour paper here. You've got the reference image, you have a drawing, grid or a line drawing to make yours any size that you like. It's a relatively simple drawing, but I think it's always important to make sure you get the eyes, the nose and the mouth in the right place. Doesn't matter then if your ears are a bit big or a bit small, but they have at least got to be in the right place for the animal to look the species that it is. We could use masking fluid here with this image as well, because we've got some white hairs that have gone down over to the dark body, but I might just show you another trick to be able to get those on if we want them afterwards. So we're not going to use the masking fluid for this. So when you look at the image of the panda, he is very white here, but the rest of him here has got colour. So we're going to find ways of mixing some interesting darks. With the standard palette that I've worked on to do my watercolour foundations course, the go-to dark for us is actually combining a blue and an orange. So to get blacks or dark greys, we're really using complementaries. So the opposite to blue on the colour wheel is an orange. So in our palette, that's going to be the ultramarine blue and the burnt sienna. And when they combine, this is how we get our black. And it's going to move sometimes towards a browner black and sometimes to a bluer. If we got the perfect amount of one to the other, we would get pretty well a black. Not sure if I can do that here in this quick little bit. Let's have a look. So there's our burnt sienna. I'm going to reach into my ultramarine blue, pop that on, and I have black. So there's my go-to colours for doing the panda from our range that are here. Also, he's got, looks like his little tongue sticking out there on the image. Let's put that in because it adds a little bit of interest. So we will use our cool permanent rose for that in a very, very watered down amount to give us a tiny little bit of pink. Then we could drop some of this pink into our dark colours to make it interesting. And where his tummy just shows here lighter bits of hair and maybe even little bits of skin, we could drop some of the pink in there to make it interesting. So we don't have to just make the painting black and white. We could make it interesting with other colours. Other colour opposites that will make black for you need to be something there dark in the first place. So if you took something like this green here, which is a very dark phthalo green, and you used perhaps alizarin crimson with it, which can be a bit of a dark red colour, and put these two in together, you will get a very interesting black. So if we had those in our palette, that's another go-to dark colour. You could, you know, put dark purples in there mixed with something else. You could take a dark paint like, this is a Payne's Grey, which almost looks black anyway. And depending what your subject is or how you want it to go into the background, just add some other interesting colour in with it. So this is putting a little bit of a magenta in with that Payne's Grey. It still reads black because it's very dark, but it's interesting. And these are things to think about when you're doing your painting. They need to be interesting. But for us, for this particular subject, we will use the burnt sienna, the French ultramarine blue, and that little bit of rose pink. So there we are. We've made our colour choices. We've got our reference photo ready, drawn it up onto the painting, the piece of watercolour paper, quarter sheet for me. So let's paint our panda. One thing to keep in mind is if you're going to use a lot of any one pigment, you better have sufficient of it out ready to do the size of the painting that you've chosen. So for me, I've got all my dark areas here, which is quite large. I'm going to be using really just about 2 tubes of paint, my French ultramarine and my burnt sienna. So I'm already looking at my wells here and saying there's not enough in there. So I'm going to squeeze a bit more of these out so that I've got plenty of paint once I get painting. So I've squeezed out lovely juicy fresh paint. So I will now make sure in my palette here, ready to go before I start painting, I've got plenty of it out here. So there's my burnt sienna. And I'll put my blue over this side so that I'm ready to go. Okay, now, wet the paper or don't wet the paper? For a start off, for our white area of our panda's face to stand out, he actually is going to have a bit of a background. Otherwise, his face has got, it's going to meld into the background too easily. So I think I might just start by dropping a wee bit of paint in the background. And I think I will just add a little bit of clean water first, up beyond the white here. Doesn't really matter if it goes over the ears, but and I've got to think about a colour. Well, I'm painting with this a fairly limited palette anyway, so I haven't got a lot of choice here. I'm going to do it with the pink, the blue, or the burnt sienna, or maybe a little bit of all of them. So I've added a bit of water there. So let's just get a little bit of something going in the background here. So I'm dropping in a bit of blue, a bit of orange, rinse my brush off, tickle the bit of paint that I've got down and say, move around a little bit. Bearing in mind this background is still going to dry lighter because I pre-wet it. So watercolour paint dries 25% lighter thereabouts, and having water down first is of course going to get it to dry lighter again. This is where you don't have to wet first before you put your paint down, but sometimes it just enables the paint to move around a little bit. You don't have to be making decisions with your brush strokes quite as important brush strokes right from the word go, because you're letting the water carry the pigment around as opposed to trying to paint it on the dry paper. So I've just put in blue, brown, dropped it in here and there. No fixed pattern as to how I'm doing it. I am thinking that when I get to the black ears up here, if I put the brown around it, the black, at least then the ears will stand out. But when I come down the side of the face here, which is white, I could have that a little darker because the face is going to be white. Then as I get down to the body, could change again. Now, unlike some paintings where you get this far and you've got to stop and let things dry, this does still have to dry. However, there's so much painting space left on here, we can carry on whilst this background is still doing its thing. Don't quite like the sharp edged mark I've got from the blue here, so I go in with a bit more blue, touch where it started, and just ask it to come out a little bit more and don't look like such a outline. You never really want to just do an outline around something. So if it looks like you've got a bit of an outline, add a bit more paint and invite it to go a little bit further out. Okay, so I have a background down. I'm going to let that dry and I'm going to work on my panda. I'll switch into a smaller brush now, so put my wash down with a big brush, get it down as fast as I can. I don't need any of it to look like joined up strokes, which is what you'd get if you put it down with a small brush. But I'm now going to do the eyes. So I do need some help with the eyes to make sure that I keep them to the size that I want. So I'll use a small brush. Now I want to highlight in the eye, and as we're not using masking fluid for this, I'm going to try and paint carefully and leave a little mark for the highlight in the eye. Now if I don't, if my paint travels and fills up the little area that I had in mind leaving white, I will show you also how we can paint that in afterwards. So given this whole area of the eye here is black, makes it a little easier to paint, because if you go over, you're going to turn some of it into black fur anyway. So just leave a little circle there as I go around with my burnt sienna here. I'm going to make this a wee bit more interesting. I'm going to put a tiny bit of pink in there. Now I could let that dry, or I can drop my blue in straight away. So my blue and my brown was going to make my black, but I've made it a wee bit more interesting by putting in that bit of permanent rose. Now when you put the blue on top of the brown that you've already put there, if it's still looking too brown, you put a bit more blue in. If you've made it too blue, you want to make it a bit, you put a bit more brown in. So I'll leave that to dry like that and do the same thing for the other eye. So the brown goes in first. choose to leave that little white highlight. Drop in the brown. My highlight on this side over here, I'd like to have been bigger, so I have choices. I either wait until the end. Oh, dragged French ultramarine paint right through there. Leave it till the end, or do I try and lift a little bit out now? It's very wet, so I may just be able to lift out a wee bit of paint. But because there's such a puddle of paint in such a small space here, it may well go back in. So I may not be able to do what I want to do there. So adding the blue now over onto the brown that I put on this side. And there's the start of our panda's eyes. Down here, I've, with my freshly squeezed out ultramarine, have it up my sleeve now, and it's gone onto my painting here. Given it's a colour that's going to go in there, it's not really going to matter. But I'm just going to wet it because I don't particularly want it to stay that thick and go all over my jumper again. So there, I'll just do that. So I want those eyes to dry. So again, because there's plenty here to paint, I can move around. Just over here, my background has just crept in a little bit there. So I could soften it with a little bit of water, carefully put my tissue there, and just take that bit of paint out. Okay, where to next? If we do the two dark ears, that will run up into our wet background. If we do some of the body here, that may also do that. So our next choice is really to do the nose and the mouth, because I don't want to do these two black areas around the panda's eyes because the eyes are still wet. So let's move on and put the nostril in. So just using our same mixture here, what I've got on here is pretty watery because I used it for the background. So I dip into a little bit of stronger mix. So not full cream, but stronger than, say, the milk consistency. And I look at my reference image here. I look at the two dark shapes of the nostril. And the little white bits that you can see underneath, just a little light catching the edge there, really. So we just try and leave a little white line there. So coming round the edge of his nose and up that side with your dark mixture. Look at the shape across the top. I haven't drawn mine in here, so I'll just have to just make that up a little bit. So I've got the top there. I'm going to rinse my brush off now, and I'm going to touch the paint that I've already put down, avoiding the nostril really dark bit because I don't want that to go running everywhere. I'll try and just sneak up onto that. Come down in between two nostril bits here. Leave a little white line underneath. And same on this one. And this is where sometimes I have a look and I think, maybe I haven't drawn up the nose quite the right shape. But sometimes it's because there's too much unpainted paper for you to gauge it. Also, you may well have to go down darker, but we make a start. knowing that we can darken it up, but not necessarily get it lighter in the areas that we need. So I like to sneak up on it and just keep adding a bit more if I think it needs it. It's more like a teddy bear right now. Okay, so whilst that nose is wet, I could invite that to bleed down a little bit for this dark area under here. So if I leave a little white line under the nose, but come under here with a bit of water, just touch one little area there, just touch the edge of the paint that was already down for the nose. It's got a bit too much water, just dab it off. I've made whiskers, yeah, coming out from that area there without actually painting them, just leaving gaps as I've invited the paint from the nose to run down into this area. Leave a little bit for the pink, which for me is just disappearing a wee bit. So dampen my brush, lift the paint off, rinse my brush again, lift it off. Okay, so those marks and the nose won't be dark enough, but I'm not going to go back in there with paint again now, whilst it's so wet. So can I move on here, or am I going to have to start using the hairdryer? As I say, we're just one day away from winter. It is cooled down. I think I can come down to the body here. I think that's pretty safe to do that. So for that, I'm going to go back into a bigger brush. I'm going to need a lot more paint. And not too thin. If I go down onto the body, put the paint for the body down too thin, I am definitely going to have to go and put more down. So when you're painting darks, especially when you want them to read black darks, you need to be generous with your paint in a creamy mix for it to read dark. You can see the difference between that amount of paint and water and this part here. So I'm going to come down under his face here and here, and because I don't want to add too much white paint, I'm just going to go from my dark paint backwards up into his face a bit, which will give the indication of white hairs coming downwards. And this comes up a little bit in there and out there. So you can see I'm being pretty generous with my paint consistency. Now, if I look here at my image, I've got his mouth here, a bit of white there. And all you do is keep adding plenty of paint to this body area. So what I'm going to do is just put this onto a bit of speed filming, that you can still see what I'm doing to get this done. I've put the colour down on my Panda's body, and I've varied the brown, I've varied the blue, and I've put it down reasonably thick. It's not quite reading dark, but depending what happens up here as to whether I add any more to it. Sometimes you have to think of waiting for some areas before you can gauge whether it's dark enough if there's no paint in lots of places on the rest of the painting, which in this case there isn't on the face. So we'll do some work on the face and then we can judge whether this is dark enough or not. So I've taken the hairdryer quickly to this part up here too, so that I could carry on and paint that for you now. So I'm going to go now to the ears and get some colour on there. And basically this is just really quite a dark mixture of the brown and the blue, and put it down. Release it off of your brush with different pressure. So you put it down, press the brush, lift the brush, and then sometimes the paint will come out thicker and thinner, bluer or browner, depending where the paint was on the brush, but at least will go down in an interesting way. Remember, we're not painting walls in a house, so we want variety. We don't want it all to look perfectly smooth and even. We want it to look interesting. And so I'm just picking up paint, thickish paint, and trying to drop it down. Now I'm painting little dark lines going into the Panda's face, as opposed to white lines coming out from the Panda's face, because that would have required me using masking fluid on the ear, which I didn't want to do. Repeating this same thing on the other ear. Now this ear is sort of sitting a bit behind the face, and this ear, because his head's turned a wee bit, has come into the face. So I just use that as my guide that I'm looking at on my reference image here, and start it in a little bit onto the face. A few little dancing hairs with the brush to do the tops of the ears, just to keep that looking a little bit interesting and not the same as the other side. And again here, this just comes in a little bit, comes round, press down on my brush, release the paint, take a few little hairs out into the background if I wish. Different pressure coming down here on the brush. Pick up a little bit of brown. Good thing about painting with a limited palette like this is you don't waste any of the paint on your palette, because you've only got the two colours and you're going to pick them up some stage or other. But that's gone down really lovely and thick. I wish even I'd get my body down a wee bit thicker than I have, so I may well have to go back in, as I say, and do more on there, but you have to judge it after you've covered up a bit more. A bit more of the white here. So that's in there, that's come down there. Maybe that could come in a little bit more. There we are, 2 ears. So now we could use this same thick mixture and do, it's dry enough for me to lean on there, around. Go to a smaller brush if you need it, put it down, bring it around. Follow your shape down. It's really just like painting the ears. Just try and leave a little white line if you can around the eye. It'll save us having to do work on it after. So if you can leave a little white line under the eye. Bring the dark paint in round here. And just fill in the shape round the side of his nose. And whilst you've got all that thick paint here, this is a time to rinse your brush off, dab out some of the moisture, touch just a little bit. It's a very big brush to do this, but just touch a little bit of the wet paint you've got there and just invite it to, like that, to be a wee bit browner where I invite it. Just invite it to come out into the white so that those patches of his eyes don't look plastered on. And you see his nose is very white, but all under here isn't. So I'm touching that bit of paint that's there and just using that to help me tell the story of the dirtier. Let's switch to a smaller brush because it's putting a lot of water on there, and the more water I put on there, the more that thick paint from in there is going to be invited to come out, and I'm not wanting it all. But it means then we can make this, as I say, not look plastered on. Whilst we've got that bit of paint come out and a bit of water, dip into a little bit of the burnt sienna and start adding a bit of that darker, stained, probably stained white fur around his nose, probably where he's busy eating for 20 hours a day. No, what do? They sleep a lot, but when they eat kilos and kilos and kilos of bamboo. Big sharp teeth ripping into it. So we've put some burnt sienna in here. Okay, so now I'll repeat the same with this eye over here. I'm stuck with my smaller brush here. If you use a bigger brush, it does stop you doing it in a fiddly fashion. It just lets you put the paint down really quickly and move on. Whereas a small one, you've got to stay in the area longer to get enough paint on there. Now, first of all, I'm just filling in the whole that dark shape as I see it, and then working out where I can bring some of it into the white surrounding fur. And I'm just trying to leave that little white line under the eye. Closer I look at this photo, I can see whiskers and hairs everywhere. So we have to decide how many of them we want to do. So I've got my dark shape down. It's looking pretty blue. So if you're worried that when you touch it you're going to just get blue paint out, go back in and just drop a bit of brown in there. Or as I did, even a little bit of the pink. Then when you invite it to come out, it won't just be blue. So I'm just touching the wet paint, which is inviting it to come out to the water that I've just put here. Because as I say, without masking fluid, I can't go back into the dark shape to make white hairs, but I can make the space between the white hairs the other way. Right, this is a very strong looking line I've got here, so I'll just, it's still wet, I'll just touch that. Just get that out the way. So looking at the rest of the face, you decide, which area is really white and which area needs some colour. So just taking a little evaluation of what I've got here, I think, got that here. I think this dark shape here could go up a little higher above the eye here. There. Maybe come down into there a wee bit. So just look at what you've got going there and decide if you need to do anything extra. I'm going to try and repeat that little bit of burnt sienna around this side of his face. Put a little bit down, add some water, let it travel out to as far as I think it needs to be. It helps define his nose. If you've got the bit of colour around the edge of the white nose. Bit of colour there. Just repeat a little bit of that darker colour here. As I say, when things dry lighter, then you've got to decide, well, do I need to go in with a little bit more? Or is it really all right as it is? Okay, I'm going to leave that amount of colour there for the minute. And I'm going to look at the mouth. So with the mouth, I can just see a little pink area. So not a lot of room on here for finding clean bits, but let's get a little bit of pink. Let's have a look at the reference photo and just drop a little bit of very pale of your cool red, which for me is my permanent rose. Little pink line dropped down and then softened back up into the colour that's already there. So it looks like poking his tongue out. I think that's what it is. Now if I try painting under here now for that dark part, his bottom lip, it's going to bleed straight up into that lovely piece of pink that I've put there. So I'm going to leave that and go and do that bit afterwards. I'm just going to try and lift out with my damp brush just a tiny little bit of the paint in this corner of the eye there. Tidy up that little shape there. Look really carefully at the image to see where there sort of are brown eyes, but they would have a black pupil even when they're brown eyes. So I'll just drop a wee bit of black or blue over my brown if need be for the pupil. Okay, so I've got that eye, that's gone up there, that's gone out there. So, okay, so I'm not going to paint under there, as I said, under the lips, but how about a little bit more colour now on that nose? So slightly more generous paint now that I can see the shape that I've got. I could have painted it in a more creamy mixture in the first place. I went about it tentatively, but I think if I do that and I make a mistake, I can do it with light paint, but if I go in with a thick paint and I don't get something right, then it's a little harder. So sometimes I might go in a little bit paler, knowing then that I could just fix it up with darker paint very easily, as opposed to lifting out lots of paint when it's a dark colour. So all I've done is looked at the shape of the nose here. Get rid of a little bit of that white up there, I didn't need it. Down there a little bit more. If it doesn't come out exactly the same, doesn't matter, as long as it reads nostrils on his nose. There, that's enough colour gone back up there. We're nearly finished this panda. We've got to do this dark under here. We've got to do a little bit of modelling in the actual head itself because it's just too light. So I will use the paint I've already just got out on the palette here, dip into a little bit of a variety of the pink, the brown, the blue, going around until I think I've got a sort of a grey shade that I rather like. Put it down here where the face is still out from that bit of white body there, and just let it come round up here. It brings the face onto a different plane than the body. Where else? A little bit up here from his face, his nose, muzzle. Put the paint down. If it looks really dark, all you've got to do is add a little bit of water and manipulate it around. You want a bit of colour in here. And above the actual nose area here, There is colour. Put the colour down. Tease it into the white with your water. Okay. So just where you see it, not brilliant white, where you see it's actually, can't just leave the white of the paper because I can see some colour there. Then you've got to use a very watery mix of your colours here and just add some in. And just to get a bit of texture going up here, I'm going to wet the face. And I'm going to use a very watery amount of paint here. This is definitely the if you put the paint down but you had water there in the first place and you think it's gone too heavy, it's so easy just to get hold of the pigment and encourage it to go into the water that you've put down, which will lighten it up. More water all the time. Water is what carries our pigment, but it enables us to get it where we want it to go, lift it out where we need it to lift out. That's still going to dry light, but it's got colour in there for round here. Because I see fur here, but here it's in the bright light, I guess, over there, and you don't see quite as much. We're nearly done here. Let's add a little bit of colour over this side, going out this way. We'll do his mouth, and we're just about done. Yeah, I think I'm going to have to dry that off to do the mouth. So I'll just use my hairdryer on the face area here and we'll do a wrap. Okay, time to finish the mouth. So I look here and I see under the nose there's a white area, then it's got to be a wee bit darker than what I've got here. So I just follow the shape that I can see here. Rinse off my brush, use the paint that's already there to soften underneath it and bring it down into the rest of the shape that I can see on here. And I can still go up with it as well, which makes it look like there's whiskers coming off the nose, but you've done it negatively really by going the opposite way. So all we're doing here is adding a wee bit more colour under there and going for a same darkish colour under his lovely lip, his tongue here I should say, coming in under the tongue. Clean off my brush, though I've still got a bigger shape to do there, so perhaps I could put a bit more in. But if ever you're not sure about what shape you're doing, you put in less. You put in less and tickle that bit of paint around and then go in and do a wee bit more. So if you're not always sure, less is more, knowing that you can put some more in later. Now, this is quite pink and colourful under here, which I guess is another area where he's done lots of chomping on his bamboo. Those white whiskers, I'm going to show you how to paint some in, but you can just drag through the paint that you've put there and it will look like some anyway. And then we'll add some more. So that's the dirty white fur under his mouth there. Okay, so I think we're just about done. I would like that mouth area to be just a wee bit darker. It's very wet. I'm not sure what's going to happen when I stick a bit more in here. Done it from the top, so it will just hopefully just go down. Nose. Okay, I think we're done. So let's have a look at those white hairs. Let's reassess the dark background there. Should we do any more? Or have we met the brief and we can leave it at that? Well, my panda is dry. Quite happy with how he's turned out. Perhaps his little bit of a lip here could have had a wee bit more pink on it. These are things that you don't know until something is dried. But look, it is so easy just to go back in there and just add a wee bit more of a colour. Like that. So I said that I would show you how to recover the white whiskers rather than have used masking fluid to paint them. Left the paper so that you could remove it and have them afterwards. I'm just going to add a little bit more brown there just as I see it. So let's look at these white. Let's look at these white areas and just see what it is we can do. See, when things are dry, this is actually when you reassess and say whether something actually needed more colour. But let's stop as I'll never get this project finished. So the white. So we have gouache, which is really opaque watercolour. And you would really only use this at the very end. It's not something you put into large areas of paper to get back white paint. If you're going to need that much of it, you're better off to have started your painting again. But a small amount is fine for making little marks. This is where I use the rigger brush. So I have my rigger brush and I dip it in, straight into the tube of the gouache. So I never mix gouache in my palette, otherwise it's likely to opaque up all my colours I've got there. Then you are just looking for where you might just be able to add a wee little mark that comes in from an area off of the face and goes over the dark of your body of your panda. But if you use this gouache, as I say, in a great big area, it is not a true looking paper colour. And it can dry a little grey. So sometimes you might have to go over something twice. So you really want to save it for some really, really fine, whoops, dropped a bit there, really, really fine areas. So if you hadn't got the highlight in the eye, you can just add a tiny little dot of it in the eye. That one actually needs darkening up a bit. If you wanted to put, if you wanted to go into the black area here, you could do it with the gouache. And there's one other item that you can use, and that is a gel pen. So it's a permanent ink. The reason you put the gouache on, by the way, only at the end is it's quite washable and reconstituting will just come off. This is a white gel pen. This one's made by Uniball. Uniball Signo. And you can buy them in different tips. This is a fine, I think. So I'll just show you here. I didn't really need this on mine, but I'm just going to show you. If I just put a couple of little marks with this, you can make some fine hairs. And of course, you're drawing with it. It can be a little bit easier than doing the gouache. So there we go. How to create black and white in watercolour, and this time with a very limited palette. So you can have a go at doing it with your French Ultramarine, your burnt sienna, or two other colour opposites, providing they will mix up a dark. And try to retain your highlights, but if you can't, use your gouache or your gel pen. Work out where you need to have a dark background against the white area of the panda. And hope you enjoy that one.